Good evening. Welcome to the FAS webinar. This is the third webinar in a series of four, and we're delighted that we've got Caroline Robinson, SRUC vet, with us this evening.
That's grand. Thanks very much. We'd been at the last webinar where we were talking a lot about chicks and about young rearing stages. We had asked, if people were interested in meat chickens as well as laying chickens for the grower webinar. Because this week we're going to be talking about more that middle stage, and then next week we'll actually be specifically talking about disease conditions to watch out for and how to prevent them, and what to do if you see them. So we're going to just have a chat about that stage between the chick stage all the way up to either point of lay or point of slaughter if you're thinking about meat chickens. And a few people had got back to us to say that yes, they were interested in meat chickens as well. So we'll be doing a little bit about the growers from a layer's perspective and a little bit about the meat perspective. It isn't just all the same, that there are some differences in management if you want the ideal well-grown layer versus the ideal well-grown meat chicken. So just a recap about finding information. There's a lot of different places that you can go. And as ever, when we talk about things on the webinar, if you read more than one book, if you look at more than one site, people's recommendations for temperatures, people's recommendations for exactly how long to leave light sources on and things like that, you will find that they're all different. As we talked about in the last webinar, everybody is talking from their own experience, and while they're not wildly different, there's usually like a couple of degrees in the temperature, there's maybe a couple of hours in the sort of lighting recommendations or whatever. It is just people's own trial and error. And how they've worked things, sometimes over decades, and tried it with various different types of chickens. So there's no one prescriptive thing, and you don't necessarily need to be making absolutely sure that you note down every little digit of every recommendation, because you will find that they do vary a little. But the important thing to know is where to find the good information. And the reason for that is there is a lot of crap on the internet, and also there are a lot of things that might be good advice, but maybe not for the UK. So you do find a lot of forums, or you find a lot of webinars or websites that are actually based in other countries, and they might have different legal requirements, they might have different welfare perspectives, they might have different availabilities for either drugs or sort of treatments or supportive things that you can use for your chickens. It is always worth knowing that you're getting your information from a reasonable source, because it is so variable naturally that you can otherwise miss the fact that maybe this shouldn't apply to you. So in Britain, we've got the chickenvet.co.uk website. That's run by chicken vet specialists. Obviously, you've got your British Hen Welfare Trust website. I'm sure a lot of you will have come across them before. Poultrykeeper.com I have in bold there, because if you were with us on our last webinar, you'll know that that is a good website that has some input from the gentleman who runs that, has had some articles and things written by vets, some of them actually from the Chicken Vet website. And he does have quite a lot of good information, but unfortunately he's having to shut that website down in May. So it's got a lot of good stuff about different breeds, a lot of good things about personal experiences of either hatching or rearing, or any of the sort of various different stages of small-scale chicken production. I do rate it. I think it's a really good website, and obviously they have gone to the trouble of getting, the right people for the right articles and things. But yeah, he's unfortunately having to close it for hosting fees in May. So I would, if you were going to look at one now, the reason that one's in bold is because you probably want to have a little look at that. And you will find a little bit about meat chickens and things on that as well. You've got your Poultry Club. If you're worried about bird flu or Newcastle disease or notifiable diseases, the APHA is usually your first port of call for information. Your local vet could do post-mortem examinations for you should you ever need, or take poo samples and that kind of thing for analysis. We have our own post-mortem facilities around about Scotland as well, SRUC vets. And as well as Jeanette putting on the webinars, if you go and have a look at where these recordings end up on the FAS.Scot website, you will find that there are other recorded webinars there as well. There's various different topics there, including handling poultry. That wasn't myself, that was one of our colleagues. There's some of the previous recordings of our webinar series. There's a whole bunch of really good stuff there as well. So plenty to be helping you out with. In terms of breeds, there are various different places you can look at for breeds. If you were looking for slaughter and disposal recommendations and guidelines and legal requirements and all the information you would need, we always recommend the Humane Slaughter Association. You'll hear quite a bit more about that later. Food Standard Scotland, you'll also hear about later. And I've got a website there, which is a poultry vet who has some, both her own books available on the website and also some stuff already up there for free in terms of information. So yeah, just a few wee links for you, and we can send those around by email so that you're not desperately scribbling away there. So if you are going to be breeding or rearing your own, we talked a little bit last week about, why would you be doing it? Do you want to get eggs? Are you breeding your own to get eggs, or are you, buying in? And the thing that you want to think about for your growers as well, most people will buy them in at about a day old. They are available, some growers at sort of like around the 6-week mark, as they're kind of ready to go outside a bit more. For meat birds, it kind of reduces the amount of advantage you would get from growing your own, because that would be really quite close, really quite far on to being close to the time of slaughter. If you were buying in pullets, a lot of people for layers will just wait until that point of lay pullet rather than having the growing phase. But it's up to yourself. There's some people will sell them at a kind of mid stage, but for a lot of people, you usually would be starting off with very young chicks, buying in your chicks, if you're not hatching your eggs. So if you are thinking about meat chickens, do think about what your local requirements are. Are you renting? Are you going to be subject to the council's requirements regarding food production places, food production businesses? What counts as for your own consumption? What counts as operating a business out of your own premises? The same if you are renting, it's not necessarily just the council. You might find private landlords or housing associations and things like that also have their own requirements. With councils as well, you do have to think about noise. If, for example, you are going to be breeding meat chickens, some of them are going to be cockerels. Yes, the idea is definitely going to be that they're probably going to be slaughtered before they start acting like cockerels, but some things don't always work out for you. So, do keep it in mind that if you're going to have cockerels and if they start being noisy like cockerels, you might find yourself on the wrong end of a noise complaint. So you just want to make sure that if you're planning on this, rather than just keeping a couple of chickens as pets or whatever, that you've got yourself right with not running into trouble if you're changing your operation at all. For meat birds, we did a lot about layer birds a couple of webinars ago regarding there's all sorts of different pure breeds. There's also really high egg producing hybrids that are specially developed for that. It's the same with your meat breeds as well. Some people use purebreds and grow them a bit slower. That tends to be very small scale. It tends to be people who are just interested in that kind of thing. They might decide to try different breeds, partly to see if they like a particular conformation or flavour a little bit better. There's some people that will swear that there are certain breeds that they really do feel are much tastier than others. You can kind of find out to your own heart's content there. Some people will also use dual purpose breeds. So those are pure breeds that traditionally were bred to provide meat and eggs. So they're not as good at egg producing as the real specialist egg producers, and they're certainly not as good at meat producing as the specialist meat producers, but they're kind of a medium weight breed in between. You can get some of them as well. In terms of your proper commercial meat breeds. You can go from a slightly slower, less extreme version of a meat breed, which are maybe a wee bit more suitable for the outdoors, right the way through to your real kind of classic, chunky, white feathered, massive breasted, specifically commercial breeds of chicken for meat production. Now, you won't see very many of them in small scale operations, quite simply because A, they don't do terribly well in extensive situations a lot of the time, and B, they are so incredibly fast. They need quite intensive management to stop them from getting ill. They need quite intensive management to stop them really from outgrowing their own bones sometimes. You know, they put on weight incredibly fast. We talked a wee bit before about broodies and breeding your own versus incubation, and now we're going to be moving on to, you know, if you are thinking about actually buying in chicks. So we kind of ended up last week getting to the sort of chickie stage that maybe they were starting to move outside at around about the 6 to 8 week stage. Marion told you all about her brooding system, which was basically a repurposed hamster cage for a week and then out to the rearing house, which was a larger pet house. But the important things remain that if you are throughout that process, it doesn't matter if you're hatching your own, it doesn't matter if you're buying in day-old chicks, you want to make sure that you don't have a slippy base and that there's nothing in the bottom of it that they're going to catch their feet in. It's just incredibly important for their bone development, their foot development, and legs when they're so incredibly delicate and bendy at those very early stages. You don't want all of your little chicks to be all huddling together because that basically is a sign that they're cold. And then eventually, as time goes on and you've successfully got them through the brooder for a week or so, you can start thinking about, you know, into the next stage of housing, and then eventually into your outbuilding or outdoor housing, which will depend on your time of year and your breed. Now, meat chickens are probably going to grow a lot faster than your layers. So if you've previously got your own little system in place like this, a wee bit like Marion's, maybe you've got all your equipment and things, you're thinking, right, okay, this is something that I've done a few times. You're going to find that the meat chickens are going to accelerate quite a bit compared to the growth rate of the layers. So do you have enough space in these different stages for bigger, chunkier guys there? You are going to be having to think about getting in different feed, and you do want to make sure that you're using it up at the right amount of time. So, you know, you can't be using your leftover sort of layer feed or even layer grower feed or whatever. And you don't really want leftover feed hanging about for months and months and months, because if it goes out of date past its best by, you will find that it doesn't have the right amount of vitamins and minerals in it. If you are buying in for meat chickens, there's not particularly a better sex. So you also might be used to, you know, getting your sex chickens in to rear your layers, because obviously you only want the females. Whereas if you're buying a batch for meat, then there's going to be a bit of a mixed batch there. Additional chick considerations. So most people, I would say, that are buying in chicks to rear for lay would normally buy them in as eggs. It's so much easier to buy them in. You know, you end up sometimes get them through the post and so on and so forth. And we talked a lot about that, you know, people's experiences buying off of eBay and things like that. A lot of people for meat chickens, if you are thinking about it, would actually be getting them as day-old chicks instead. So you want to think about, where are you going to get these chicks? Are they basically going to be eggs that you hatch, or are you going to be buying in your chicks? How are you going to source these? Are you going to go and collect them by yourself, or are you going to get chicks in the post? There are some couriers that will do chicks in the post, sort of very obviously short term. Although at the moment it is worth thinking about the fact that there's quite a lot of bird flu protection zones in place just now, and if there's any place that is in a bird flu protection zone, they can't send any bird products in and out. So at this time of year, besides the fact that it's terrible weather anyway, at this time of year you might also find that it's a lot harder to really get any kind of chickens or eggs or whatever, because there's quite a few places that are under restriction. Restriction zones can be, kilometres across. Basically, it's not just one farm that is then included. You end up with quite a large part of the surrounding country that's included as well. So if you are buying in chicks, they are incredibly delicate, and you really need to be prepared before, and you need to act fast. If you've got your eggs coming through your post, obviously you've got a little bit of time to sort of look through everything. I've got something else to do for an hour, I better go and sort that out first, and then I'll come back and I'll deal with the eggs or whatever. Chicks are really delicate. They're different. If you've got these little day-old things that are super stressed and they've just been delivered to you, they're all huddled in a box together. During the summer, they could have been subjected to a bit too high a temperature. During any other time of year, they could have ended up sitting about in a van as somebody's tootling about and getting chilled. They are so delicate that if a chick gets overheated or over chilled for too long a time during delivery, even if you get them all sorted out with feed and water and they're right under the brooder immediately, you make sure everything's right, especially with the overheating, they can then just have so much damage that they will die of organ failure a few days later. So if you are thinking about sorting out chicks, you just want to get your timing sorted. You want to know, right, we're getting the chicks at this point, the brooder's already heated up. We've had that brooder lamp on for a good few hours beforehand. We've checked the temperature. We've got that feed and water ready. As soon as the chicks are with you, get them sorted out, get them into the brooder. Don't just be leaving them in the box and go and wander off and sort of do something else for an hour. It can sometimes make the difference. That is just definitely a fact. You want to check over all your little chicks. You look for any outliers. Is anybody already looking sick? Is there anybody not quite the right shape? Shouldn't really be having any of those problems. And then we need to make sure that they understand what they're meant to do in terms of feed and water. So we talked a little bit last time about just dipping their beaks in their tepid, sort of not too large drinker, so that they can't fall in because then they'll get damp. Just dip their beaks in the tepid water to show them where the water is. Make sure that the chick crumbs are on a nice good contrast background so that chicks will peck at contrast. So, if you've got beige chick crumbs on a dark background or some other coloured background so that they're not blending in with something the same colour, that's ideal. And that will really give you your best in terms of starting them off. If you do go for meat chickens, they will be finished quite young. They are usually quite fast-growing commercial meat birds. They can grow very fast sometimes. Your sort of traditional, what people in the media sometimes call Franken chickens, if you like, although I really do hate that kind of phrase. I feel like we can talk about things in slightly more sensible terms, but your sort of proper commercial bird that is meant to really mature super fast. If you keep them for more than that sort of 6-7 weeks, they will over mature. It is no exaggeration to say that they are genuinely not capable of living life after that point of their ideal production. So, I understand where the Franken chicken kind of term came from. But yeah, there's no way that you're just getting a few spare from your local commercial meat operation if they're doing the really fast-growing birds, because they're probably not going to suit your system. They are bred to be obese. It is a welfare problem to keep them longer. Obviously, they are in a situation as well where high mortality is encountered relatively frequently. So they're not bred to be particularly hardy. They're bred to make profit. You can sometimes, with some of the faster growing meat breeds, rear them in different ways to try and slow them down, because part of their growth is genetic, part of their growth is intensive management. But yeah, I don't know how much success people have with that. If you were getting a pure meat breed, the really extreme end of that, how long that it might take to mature if you were going for a pure breed meat version and it wasn't a particularly fast growing breed, your traditional old heritage type breeds, at the extreme end, some of them can take sort of 18 to 20 weeks to mature. At that point, you are probably starting to get to the point where you're juggling between flavor and texture. Because some people will find that if things are left for a few months, if they develop very slowly, and they are developed over a few months, then sometimes you do end up with a bit more of a stringy texture. And you will find people that will swear that that's more flavoursome and all the rest of it. It's going to be personal preference. A lot of the people that you'll find, the experts that have sort of written books about it and so on, will be in the middle. So you've got your really extreme 6 weeks, crazy fast growing, and then at the other end you've got people with real sort of slow growing heritage breeds. Most people are kind of in the middle of that. It's not quite so much. And it's worth saying as well that from a meat breed perspective, if it is a commercial meat breed bird, they have been bred specifically to be really docile and a bit helpless and a bit inactive, because the more energy and the more running about that they're using using their muscles for, they're burning that feed rather than putting on more meat. They're using it up for their movement, for their running about, looking at things and so on. Same with temperature. No matter what type of bird you have, they will be using some of their feed intake to keep themselves warm, of course. And that doesn't matter if it's your layer pullets, it doesn't matter if it's your grower pullets. It is just basically going to be a factor into how successful you find your operation at different times of year of getting your nice well-grown chickens, either your nice well-grown layers or your nice well-grown growers, meat growers. You are going to find that that's going to be harder and slower if it's cold outside, compared to if they're just dancing about in the summer, really. I'm just going to shut my door because just on that last slide, my dog got a hold of his squeaky toy and it's incredibly distracting. Sorry if you heard that. I'm just going to shut the door on him. So with regards to if you're looking for either your pullets for growing, pullets for laying, or if you're looking for your growers for meat, welfare of farmed animals does state that you really want to, get the type of genes or the type of phenotype, which is just the sort of shape and the look of a thing, so that your chickens can be kept without detrimental effect on their health or welfare. So that's just an example in the bottom corner there of that very, very top-heavy kind of, those of you that already have layers will know you don't get these massive, gigantic breasts on layer chickens. Layer chickens are a real shock to people when they pick them up because they've only ever seen in Tesco that kind of real convex, puffy breast that you would expect to get on a meat chicken, and then you get this pointy, mad little layer thing that, almost feels triangular in comparison. So whether or not we can actually say that these guys here fit the spirit of that particular piece of legislation, it is a wee bit of a moral conundrum. So if you are thinking to yourself, I would quite like to grow meat chickens for myself, for my family, or if you're thinking to yourself, I would quite like an extensive operation just to supply my local community with some meat, we do want to keep welfare in mind. And we also want to keep in mind why we might be doing these. Is it all about the money, or is it also a little bit about the circumstances of rearing and how we want to keep our animals, really? If you are looking at a slightly more commercially shaped bird, but you do want them to slow down a bit, that is something that some people have experimented with. These chunky little guys, they're in a warm shed. They're not encouraged to move around a lot. They are supposed to just stand still and put on weight. So with these chunkier proper commercial meat breeds, you will find that if they're outside, they're out on grass, they're wandering about, they're experiencing lower temperatures, you will find that they do slow. You can slow that growth down to about sort of 9 or 10 weeks instead of about 6 weeks for maturity. But also, it's worth thinking about whether or not they're actually designed for taste. It is still quite fast development. You know, if you're looking for a real sort of gourmet homegrown experience, are those particular breeds actually suited for that? And also, as we say, they're not necessarily particularly suited for hardiness. We are up here in Scotland, so to pop them out even in a Scottish summer might be asking a little bit much of them. So moving on to slower growing hybrids, they might mature round about the 2 to 3 months mark. So you're kind of looking at about 9 to 12 weeks. That's, as I said, in the middle of the fast growing ones and the real slow growing traditional pure breeds sometimes. Some types will be touted to have extra flavour. You will see lots of people arguing about what they think is the very best combination for the most delicious chicken for your table. And we talked during the layer webinar a little bit as well about the hybrids, either the commercial hybrids, which really produce loads and loads of eggs, but they might not necessarily have the feathering for the Scottish winter, for example, versus slightly hardier hybrid layers, such as things like the Black Rock, that were actually developed with the Scottish climate in mind. They were developed to sort of think of feathers that would kind of hold the rain off, and you know, an active foraging habit where they walk around and they dig things and they get some of their own nutrition from that as well. Just active, kind of healthy, hardy birds. So that there's all sorts of crosses that you'll find people arguing about, either from a layer point of view or from a meat breed point of view. When you are talking about meat breeds, you'll see a lot of recommendations for what crosses people personally have tried out and felt were the best. It's not just about the taste, though. I think if you were gathering opinions and some people were saying, oh no, you know, this is the hybrid that I would use for meat, or oh no, this is the hybrid that I've found produces the most eggs, that's only part of the picture. People from different parts of the country, there's different climates. People from Cambridgeshire are going to have a very different time of it than people in Argyll. Those meat breeds are not going to put on the same weight, and those egg layers are not going to produce the same amount of eggs if we haven't managed to meet their needs in terms of their preferred environment. And in some cases, that'll, you know, work in our favour if it's cooler up here, and in some cases it might work in their favour down south if we are wetter up here, for example. So don't just, if you're looking at recommendations for either laying or meat, don't just look at the one characteristic that you think is most important, because they might not have that characteristic in your place. And here's an example. Every chicken breeding book or website or whatever, people will keep their notes about what they've found with each particular lot. So you've got your kind of classic fluffy laying pet slash, you know, companion type birds we see most often with Orpingtons, but some people have actually had a go at how well they grow from a meat perspective, as well as obviously ranking them from egg perspective. Your Hubbards, you will find mentioned quite a lot. There are some places in Scotland that will sell those as day-old chicks for meat. They're sort of in the middle. As you can see, they're not maturing at like 6 weeks, that kind of incredibly fast. They're kind of more moderate around about the 12-week mark. And some people have already made notes for you as to how they behave. So, you know, here we find that they have said they're really good free rangers, they're really calm, you might not have to fetch them out of trees, for example. You know, it's there's a lot of good information out there, from everything from your real sort of traditional pure breeds all the way through to various types of crosses and hybrids. So that's an example from one book. I was on a website earlier today. There was like a whole bunch of different recommendations. Everybody, hopefully, will just tell you theirs. And my point for you guys is that if you do start either trying different egg laying breeds, developing them, growing them on, especially when you're developing and growing them on, to be honest, because then you can track them over a larger period of time as to how successful you've been with them. Keep your own notes. I haven't really bothered with laying chickens in the past because I would buy different laying chickens to try them out. That was kind of a thing that I used to try different barred rocks and leg bars and so on and so forth. Try various different ones out, and they were such distinct personalities that it was quite easy, I think, to keep track of what I thought of each one in small numbers. If you're dealing with larger numbers and you've got a real mix of different layers, or if you try and batch after batch in different years of meat chickens, it can be actually quite tricky to remember what things you tried 2 years ago that worked really well versus the things that didn't work so well. So keep your notes, get stuck in there the same way that these people have, and write down what they are, where they came from, how you found them, any drawbacks, is there anything that worked well or didn't work well. It's well worth keeping your own notes. With regards to activity and hardiness, especially when they're in that grower phase, because that sort of medium, sort of 6 weeks to kind of 18 weeks sort of phase, they're still basically teenagers. They're still growing, they're still developing. Anything that is putting on weight or building bones and growing and getting bigger and reaching maturity, that's quite a vulnerable time of life, because you've just put a bit of pressure on a body to do a job, and at the same time it is also trying to fend off all the diseases and deal with the climate and do all of the things that they're meant to do. So any sort of big push for production, it is going to be a bit of a stressful time. So you really want things that are quite hardy, and you want to make sure that you're keeping up with the required feeding regimes as well. It is about husbandry as well as just choosing the right birds. So we'll talk a little bit about the feed, because we got through to chick crumbs last time. You do always want proper chick crumbs, and that's because it's really high in protein, regardless of whether you're going to be getting layer chicks or faster growing commercial meat birds. You do definitely want your proper chick crumbs to start off with. However, it's a little known fact sometimes, unless you've gone looking or it's something that you've experienced, but actually there are different types of chick crumbs, and you sometimes find that there's slightly different protein levels. So for example, the layer chicks might be on a lower protein chick crumb, around about 20%, compared to perhaps 22 to 24% for meat chicks. So even at that tiny stage, when you're just got them on the chick crumbs, they actually have slightly different nutritional needs. Those meat birds are already going to be a bit more predisposed to putting on weight faster. And conversely, you're going to want them to put on weight faster as well. You're not trying to have slow growth with lots of feathers and really strong bones that are going to last for years throughout life. You're actually wanting these things to put on, the meat that you wish to get from them. If you've got really slow growing meat birds, if you've got those real heritage breeds that are going to take a long time to mature, they will be fine on this sort of 20% layer chick feed. But if you've got something that's a little bit more accelerated in its development, you want slightly higher protein, and you'll find that listed as meat bird starter or something like that. It won't just be layer chick crumbs or anything. They will probably say on the label that it is specifically a meat bird starter. Some of them do come with coccidiostats in it. You're going to have to make your decision as to whether or not that suits what you need. If you do have coccidial problems, obviously you're probably going to err towards a coccidiostat in the feed. If you don't have coccidial problems, you're doing really, really good management with plenty of access to clean ground and things like that, that coccidia isn't a problem in your premises, then you may wish to avoid that. You obviously feed your chick crumbs at will. you want to avoid contamination as much as possible. And then at the 4 to 6 week mark for meat birds, you're going to be thinking sort of more towards the 4 week mark. For the layer birds, you're maybe going to be thinking more to the sort of 6 week mark. You're going to be thinking about introducing growers' pellets and stopping the chick crumbs. And again, that's always gradual. If you didn't hear about it in the last webinar, if you're changing the diet, you want to mix increasing proportions of the new diet over maybe about a week or something into the old diet so that they gradually change over. You don't want a sudden change. If you're raising meat birds, you might also find that the lighting advice might be different. You'll find a lot of obviously lighting is a lot of the time based on the fact that we do have a son, so their natural development, had they been with their mum, would have been to have periods of light. You'll find some people advising for meat birds that they maybe start off with a higher light time, with a bit of a taper down as you add in shade. So the higher light time at the start can help increase their feed intake earlier on, but you don't want them to absolutely stuff themselves for weeks. You do want to keep a control on that. You don't want them to outgrow their own bones. So as time goes on, you do add in a bit more dark. And as well, the one thing that I've seen people mention either or, there's some people that will obviously say for chicks, for welfare, understandably, you're going to want to have periods of dark and periods of light like you would in real life, because that is the natural way to do things. And we do all have a natural body clock. And then on other websites, if people are looking more at developing their chickens, they'll talk about, having just light for 2 or 3 days, and then gradually adding in a slightly longer period of darkness, hour by hour over a sort of short period of time afterwards. And that accelerates the production, sort of gives them a head start, if you like, from that point. This is all stuff that really you're going to have to make your own mind up what works for you. If you are just rearing your own layer chicks, you probably want to try and make sure that everything's as natural as possible, and that they do get sort of a long night time like they would in real life if you weren't using artificial lighting, because we are wanting these birds to develop gradually and with good bones and good feathers and all the rest of it. Too much light can sometimes result in feather pecking and bullying and all sorts of fidgety kind of behaviour. Meat birds might not leave the heat lamp for as long. We've kind of said that, you gradually lift the heat lamp further and further away, maybe sometimes as long as 6 weeks, depending on the time of year. Because meat birds are so big and chunky, you might find that you can maybe get away with taking it away after 4 weeks, because they will be much larger with more body mass. So that's a difference sometimes between the two types of growers. Grower feed is also different. So we talked a bit about grower feed last time from a layers perspective. Meat bird grower feed is what you want for meat birds, and regular layer bird grower feed is what you want for your layer birds. Really fast growing breeds sometimes overeat. You actually sometimes need to control their food for welfare. So if you've gone and bought something really quite extreme that is going to grow really fast, please be aware that ad lib feeding might then no longer be on the menu, so to speak. You might have to step in and do a bit more management and do meal times. If you are having to restrict their feed a little bit, that increases boredom and it increases hunger. So, it's another sort of strike in the column for perhaps a slower growing meat bird. Layers grower usually start at around about sort of 6 weeks or so, 6 to 8 weeks or so, and you're going to be going through to around about your 18-week point of lay when you're going to have to change them onto layer feed. It's about 18% or so as well. Your meat grower is going to be an extra stage in your sort of diet changes. So for your layers, you've got your chicks, and then you've got your growers, and then you've got your point of lay. They go on a layers feed. For your meat growers, you might find that you've got your meat grower, your meat chick crumbs, and then your meat grower feeds. and then they might actually go on at around about 12 weeks to go to a slightly lower protein finishing feed until your target weight. Partly that can be because your grower feed may, if you've got coccidial problems, be medicated with an anticoccidial stat, but you want them on an unmedicated feed for the last little bit. And also, some meat feed manufacturers say that for a bit of intramuscular fat and sort of eating quality, and to put a bit of a bloom on the carcass, if you like, sort of a little bit of fat and a little bit of flavour, you want a finisher feed rather than the grower feed. Whether or not all of those are successful, I honestly don't know. I'm sure you could find lots of people at the agricultural store that have tried various different things. But just be aware that there is the possibility sometimes that meat bird grower might have to be stopped a little bit earlier than your layer grower would be stopped. And there is such a thing as a finisher feed. And do make sure that whatever you're feeding them has appropriate withdrawal periods on it if it has any medication. Some anticoccidials have no withdrawal period for meat. Some anticoccidials do have a withdrawal period. That's the time that you have to stop feeding them that medication before you're allowed to slaughter and eat them. Otherwise, you end up getting anticoccidial as well, which, I don't think many of us need, thankfully. So yeah, be aware of the different types of feed. Be aware that you might have to change it up a little bit more if you're doing your meat birds.
Okay, Caroline, we've got a question, so maybe I could just interrupt before we move on to the next slide.
Absolutely.
So I've got a question about what food for dual purpose birds? Do you have to choose which birds are for laying birds and for meat and keep separate?
No, so if you do have a slower growing meat bird, they will do okay on your layers crumbs and your layers grower sort of early on. What will probably happen with those is once you select who's going to be who, you are going to have to do that sort of quite early. Sometimes that's as easy as being cockerels versus hens, depending on how many you have. But the meat feed, the meat grower feed will basically be one of the things that starts putting weight on your chickens. So they will be fine if it's a slower growing meat breed, basically a dual purpose breed. They'll be fine on your layers chick crumbs. Then you're going to have to work out when it is you're going to make your decision as to who's going to be for which pipeline. And you make sure that your meat growers are on your meat grower feed and your layer growers are on your layer grower feed. Because what you don't want is you don't want your layers growing too fast. You don't want them packing on loads of muscle and kind of slightly outgrowing your bones. You want them to be slow and steady, producing really strong, durable bones. Their frame size is increasing gradually. There's no benefit to having the layers absolutely rocket up in size. It's not going to be great for their durability for sort of months to years in the future. So yeah, I would try and decide as early as you can and make sure that they're on the appropriate diet for that.
That's excellent. Thank you very much.
What have I done there? Oh, yes. So we've talked about the diet and then obviously grit sizes as well. Just a wee reminder there that while you've got them on the feed, your grit sizes are usually increasing as they're growing as well. And again, you'll probably find that quite well labelled in a lot of agricultural stores, that maybe they're sort of early grower size grit right the way through to kind of normal layer size grit adult sizes. And then, of course, with your layers, you transition to your layer pellets at the point of lay. If you are going to transition them at the point of lay, you've decided these guys are your layer chickens, just be aware that you want to start giving them some oyster shell or limestone or whatever for the calcium. You want to make that nice and available at least about 4 weeks prior. They're going to need that extra calcium just to start making eggshells when they transition to the point of lay. And also be aware of the time of year. We've talked a little bit about the fact that they're not going to develop as fast, whether they're layer pullets or grower birds. They're not going to develop as fast if they are exposed to cold and so on. That means a bit of pre-planning, because if you are thinking about getting either a batch of growing point of lay chickens, or if you are thinking about a batch of meat chickens, When are you going to bring them on? Is that going to be, for example, the ideal time, sort of mid-spring, early summer, where it's not too hot? That would mean late summer to autumn dispatch if you were going for meat chickens, but it would also mean that if you were growing on your layers that early on, that you might end up hitting the point that they were meant to start laying around about the time of year that the decreasing light means they don't want to start laying. So if you are starting to hatch mixed batches, you are going to have to think about what that actually means. Do you end up trying to slaughter and process chickens in an incredibly hot July? That doesn't really sound like that much fun. It is just, it's going to be a case of get the calendar out, sort of work out, right, they're going to be 6-week-old at this point, they're going to be ready to slaughter or ready to lay at this point. Is that going to be horribly hot and stinky and we're going to struggle with the carcasses, or is that going to be right before the autumn when none of them are going to want to progress really after point of lay to lay a good number of eggs? It can be a wee bit trickier if you've got a mixed batch, basically, is what I'm trying to say. Also, if you're asking for chicks rather than eggs, you might find there's a wee bit of a lead time on the orders for your suppliers. We talked the last time about transitioning the heat by raising the bulb and then weaning them off at around about 6 weeks-ish layer time, maybe about 4 weeks-ish meat breed time if they're a lot bigger. No matter what you've been doing with your light, do make sure that they are properly used to darkness and similar conditions to the new hut or wherever you're headed with them as the grower stage. As I said previously as well, people's recommendations for lights vary. So one example that I saw a couple of months ago was have your brooder light on for 24 hours for the first couple of days, and then down to about 20 hours for the rest of the first week, and then eventually transition to 8 hours of dark for the second week. And that was somebody specifically talking about meat birds, whereas, you know, there's other websites talking about layers that would absolutely recommend having a proper day and night time for layer chicks pretty much from the first couple of days solidly onwards. It can be difficult depending on what type of heat you're using. If you're using a heat lamp, some of those come with light, and then you can't switch off the light without switching off the heat. So that's when we started talking a little about the electric hen brooders, which are more expensive, but they do have the advantage that you can supply heat, proper heat, without necessarily having the accompanying light on all the time. You don't really want them to end up sort of feather pecking and some of the behavioural issues that you may get with 24 hours of light constantly for weeks. That you do want to make sure that they don't go outside and then have kittens because it's the very first time at sort of 6 weeks of age that they've ever seen darkness. That would be really problematic. So some of the pictures that Marion showed, just to jog your memory, those guys in there with an electric hen brooder at the bottom there, that plastic yellow thing. And you can just see that there's plenty of substrate for them to scratch about in. There's nothing for them to catch their toes on, but also it's not slippy. All of the things that we talked about for good development. Once you do have them outside, are you going to be moving them around? Is it a movable strip grazing kind of thing? Or are you going to have cleanable run areas? These are your kind of mid stage chickens are going to be susceptible to things like bacterial infections and coccidiosis, that disease that we talked about. I'll go into that in more depth in the next webinar. Do remember, if you've reared layer chickens before through the grower phase and you think you know how many you can fit into your particular paddock or area or shed or whatever, these meat guys are going to be chunkier. They are going to need more space. Do keep an eye constantly on the ones that are not developing properly. And do make sure that they always have sufficient shelter and space in that shelter, because just because that they have a kind of rough idea of plenty space per chicken, if you have an adverse weather event that means that they all decide that they want to get in one part of that space because it's the best, most sheltered part of the space, then all of a sudden you don't have that kind of amount of of space per chicken that you thought you did, because practically they've all just gone and shut themselves in a smaller area. Environment really benefits from enrichment, and that goes for your meat chickens as well. We don't really want these indolent kind of potatoes that kind of sit as commercial breeds in the one place for 6 weeks, like you would get from the supermarket. If you're going to be rearing your own, you probably do want them to be quite active and quite hardy. Part of that could be playing about with brassicas and sweet corn cobs and barriers and bales to hop up on. And if you do provide perches, just remember at this stage, your layers and your meat chickens, no matter what, both of them at the grower phase, they have quite soft bones. If you don't make sure your perches are a couple of inches wide, if you provide them with perches that are too narrow, they actually bend their breastbones. I've seen it in the post-mortem room. They get a real deformation of the breastbone. You do want to make sure your perches are wide enough. All of that increases their activity. It's good for the joints and their bones and their development and their boredom and just everything, really. So let's make sure that they're out there having quite a bit of fun. How to judge your finishing? That's always fun. It is going to partially depend on preference. Basically, when meat birds reach their full size and really not much beyond, by the time they've kind of hit their adult size, you don't really want to be anything beyond that is just, they're eating your money. So some people will do it a wee bit earlier for economical reasons. It'll depend on space reasons. Birds can be eaten earlier than that kind of ideal point, and they can be eaten later than that ideal point. Some people will leave them a bit later, specifically because they think it improves the flavour, and some people will take them a wee bit earlier because they feel it's much more tender, or because they are starting to run out of space and they want to maybe slaughter them and thin them a little bit at a time rather than killing the whole lot of them on one day. It really depends on what your setup's going to be. If it's laying or crowing, that is now an adult. So you do have that very definite sort of, oh, there we go. Okay, that is now an adult chicken. Some people, as the cockerels, if they have a bunch of cockerels that they're growing on for meat, they might again stagger the slaughter with some being taken earlier, specifically just because they might be starting to get a bit more conflict in the group. So that can be another reason sometimes that some people will eat some of them a little bit before their full size, and then some of them at their full size, some of them very slightly later. Welfare-wise, you guys are responsible for any that are not developing properly, so don't go off into the idea that you're going to grow on your own layers or you're going to grow on your own meat birds without dispatching any. This is a delicate phase. It's not the same as just having a whole bunch of layers that you have for 1 or 2 or 5 years or whatever, and occasionally one of them dies. You can find yourself in a situation that you are going to have to dispatch some during the growing phase. Then obviously, if you are thinking about meat chickens, you're going to have to be responsible for those that are ready for slaughter, responsible for cockerels, if regardless of whether you've grown on your own layers and now you've got cockerels that you weren't expecting, or if you've got the meat birds, and responsible for any signs of illness as well. There are the odd, very rare thankfully, but there is the odd person that will go ahead with the idea of getting a batch of chickens, growing them on, and then finding that they really do or should have to dispatch a few, and then they don't want to. They don't want to deal with it. They think, gosh, actually, this is not my thing. I really regret this. And they're not ready. So just be aware, dispatch is going to be almost unavoidable. You're going to have to be ready for it and do it right. Briefly mentioned coccidiosis, obviously going to talk about it in the health webinar. For those who don't know, it's a disease of young birds at this grower phase. Doesn't matter if you're layer or meat. It's a wee parasite, but it's a little sort of what we call a protozoa. It's not a worm, it's a little cell that kind of just lives in the gut lining, and you can get diarrhea or bloody diarrhea often at around about this sort of 3 to 6 week mark of age, and they can go downhill extremely fast, so quickly. So if you do think that you've got diarrhea going through your sort of chick to grower phase birds, early grower phase, and especially if there's any blood in it, do get on that immediately. Don't just wait and see. Get it diagnosed, and if you need to, get some treatment in there. Prevention's always better than cure. There is a vaccine, but the experience of one of the guys that wrote an article at Chicken Vet was that it's quite tricky to get right for smaller keepers. There's also anticoccidials in feed, but they're not a fail-safe. So some people will buy in the medicated feed, but it won't completely prevent coccidiosis if you have horrible environmental contamination. So you do need a lot of hygiene, a lot of ventilation, good disinfectant. Some people add drying agents to the litter as well to help with the moisture. A low level of exposure to coccidia is needed so that they develop immunity, but we don't want them to encounter so many coccidia that they get sick. It's a real balance. There are other young bird problems as well. They could be viruses, they could be bacterial infections, they could have come with them if you are buying in day-old chicks, or they could be acquired on your premises. And there's also worms to think about as well. Stress predisposes to illness, which is one of the reasons that these growers, either layer or meat growers, are going to be a bit more susceptible to illness than just your old biddy hen that's kind of trundling around in her garden that she's known for many years. You'll get your sort of 3-year-old or whatever layers that you're quite used to trundling about in your garden. They're not really under any stress. They're quite resistant to a lot of illnesses. If you put growers in the same environment, you might suddenly find that, oh my goodness, these things are developing illness, and it's just because they're trying to grow. They're really busy doing something. If you stress them out further while they're already doing this, then they can sometimes all get sick at once, which is a horrible thing to happen. It's one thing trying to pick out and nurse or isolate or treat a sick hen, but it's another when a whole batch of your growers have gone down with illness. So just keep on top of your husbandry. And we've talked about that as well. Your information, some of the information you find online will be illegal or bad practice depending on where you've got it. So that's why I had all those links at the start for you. Also be aware if you are thinking about your food producing, your eggs or your meat or whatever, you're going to have to think about your records of medications and mortalities. You're going to have to keep the proper requisite records, and you're going to have to keep them for the right amount of time. So the Scottish Government website is really good for just letting you know exactly what records and things you're going to have to keep up with. The first one of which definitely being the Scottish Kept Bird Register, but certainly there are requirements for medications and mortalities as well if you're growing on your chickens. We also produce some technical notes at the moment. I'm not sure how many of them are available on the website, but we're just rebuilding our website just now. But there are also really good ones for different birds on, as I say, the Scottish Government website. There is, if you go on to gov.scot and you look for the guidance for the welfare of meat chickens, there's a whole document talking about all different. Not all of it is going to be legally required of you, that's for sure, because small-scale operations are not the same as large. But I do find that the document is quite good at telling you what things are Schedule 1, which might apply to smaller premises, and what things are Schedule 2. And it just talks really a lot about the welfare and about the different procedures and the housing requirements and all of the things that you should be thinking about if you want to make yourself a proper meat operation. And there's also the guidance for the welfare of laying hens and pullets. That has a lot of good information in it as well. And actually a lot of the information that you would find in any talk or textbook for free, which is great. So yeah, it's a good resource, that gov.scot website. The last thing that I'm really going to talk about tonight is the slaughter, because we did get asked about it to just be covered as part of tonight's webinar. It can be really difficult to find the information, so don't worry, we've gone out there and we've found it for you. Essentially, the problem has been that the provision of things like resources and training has been a bit patchy and piecemeal ever since the legislation was changed. I think it was back in 2012. But the best practice advice is always going to come from the Humane Slaughter Association. Their website has an in-depth, very detailed guide about poultry slaughter at home, and it's also free. They also talk about slaughtering chickens for other reasons, such as disease and things like that. So, they've got you covered. They also have documents about catching chickens and handling chickens. There is a good demo on the FAS.Scot website that I talked about that our colleague had produced, but the Humane Slaughter Association also produce good guides. There's wee videos, there's pictures, there's everything from prep, catching and handling, how to restrain them, various methods of stunning that are available, and slaughter, everything you could possibly want to know. Essentially, they're a charity and they do some really fantastic work. Your basics is that, you really do have to think about reading up and preparation. If you go on to produce any meat for sale, you're going to end up having to sort yourself out with certificates of competence. So the way that you would need to do that is you would need to get your experience, you would need to get your equipment, all of that I'll talk to you about in the next couple of slides before we finish. If you're slaughtering just for your home consumption, do make sure that you do get adequately trained. It's obviously not going to take you through a whole certificate of competence or any of the things that you need if you're going to be selling, but do treat it like you do want to take it as a bit of a qualification. Do find out from other people how they do it. Do try to get them to show you. Do get them to watch you. Make sure that you've got really good technique on the go before you're just starting to do your own. You're also going to want to make sure that you have an idea of what equipment you're going to need. A wee top tip, if you are slaughtering anything, it's a good idea to make sure that you have everything set up on the day really nice and early, because ideally you're going to want to go and get your chickens where the light is low and they're still sleepy. They also don't have a full crop because it should have emptied overnight. They've been in their housing, they've not had access to feed overnight, they've been asleep, and they've got an empty crop. Otherwise, you're going to have to deal with crop contents when you're trying to dress your chickens. And so that's stinky, mushed up food that is at the base of the neck. And if you're trying to process your chicken and pluck your chicken and so on, and then get it all nicely dressed, you don't need to be dealing with mushed up food in the crop, where it can just spill out all over your meat. You want everything calm and quiet and routine. So that's what we want you to know is get that information from the HSA, make sure you get some good practice with somebody trusted, and make sure you're always prepared and get things done nice and early. For those of you that might go on to think about meat, you've popped up, Jeanette.
We've just got a question maybe before we nip on to selling meat. Got a question
sure.
Of, how are we supposed to dispose of culled birds?
Basically, that does come under the animal byproducts regulations. So if you are culling birds, you're supposed to dispose of them through the knacker. And I know that some of you could potentially be in some of the areas that have a derogation because you don't have a knacker. So if you are in one of those areas that, for example, allow on-farm disposal because you're maybe out in the Highlands and Islands or somewhere one of those areas that the government obviously understands that you don't have a knacker. If you're in one of the areas for on-farm disposal, then there will be provision for that. That if you are culling birds regularly in the sort of normally covered areas for knacker provision, then they're all under the animal byproducts legislation. So it's got to really be a licensed person to dispose of them for you.
Thank you very much. We'll let you move on to meat now.
Yeah, it was just because we had that last sort of question last time. I just wanted to give you the sources of where you can find your training, because that is the thing that people say to me all the time on the Smallholder Festival is, we're required to have a certificate of competence. I have no idea of who gives them out, no idea where to apply. Essentially, how it works is you have to apply for a temporary certificate that's going to allow you to get training and experience in slaughter. And then at the end of that period, when you've done your HSA training and you've been supervised, an assessor is going to come out and assess you from the Food Standard Agency, and they are going to test you. And then once you pass the test, you'll get your certificate of competence. So the qualifications come from an organisation, well, the only place at the moment that's giving out qualifications in Scotland just now, I think, is FDQ. They issue the qualification, but actually their representatives in Scotland just now are the Food Standard Scotland. So all of it's on their website. I will show you. So FSS issue your temporary certificate. FSS provide the assessor. You have to study. You're probably going to have a look at all those Humane Slaughter Association resources. I would absolutely contact the HSA for details of their training days. They recently hired somebody in Scotland who's been quite busy trying to organise training days. Bird flu is getting in the way a wee bit, unfortunately, but yeah, there is definitely somebody up here that is working to try and make sure that that's provided for. Ideally, your training day would then come at the end with an access to the assessor from the Food Standard on the same day. If everybody can get their ducks in a row, pardon the pun, and make sure that the training and the assessing all happens in the same place at the same time, that'll save you a bit of time and money. Here we are. This is the Food Standard Scotland website. I would go at the little sort of magnifying glass box and search slaughter. That will take you to this page. And if you scroll down, you should come to this button, the guidance on full and temporary certificate of competence. If you click it, that'll bring you to this page, and they have everything. In addition to all of I think they've got the application for the temporary certificate of competence. They've got guidance notes on the certificate of competence. They've got all the assessment packs so you can know what sorts of questions you're going to be asked during the test for the certificate. They've got everything on that page. So that'll tell you where you need to go to get yourself sorted out. At the same time, in terms of the actual slaughtering, the best ways of doing it, the best practice, the limitations, the ways you are not supposed to do it, all of that information. Again, we're back to the Humane Slaughter Association online guides that have got various guides for on-farm killing for disease control, electrical water bath stunning, they've got gassing, they've got stunning, they've got, neck cutting, they've got everything there, basically. Everything you could possibly want, and they're really approachable. If you do ever get onto a website like either Food Standards or HSA, and you're kind of guddling about and you're not quite sure that maybe the thing that you're looking for is there, these sites they're actually run by a team that are really approachable from a contact point of view. If you just want to find out what the latest updated guidance is, or make sure you have the right pack, just give them a ring or drop them an email. There will be contact details on both. I did check the other day to make sure. We will also talk about worms next week during the health webinar, but I did want to just let you know that one of the reasons that if you're growing batches of either layer growers or meat growers, that you might want to think about strip grazing or moving them around a lot, it's the worms. They're young, they're susceptible to worms. Worm eggs can build up incredibly fast on your pasture. So we all probably have known about worms or experienced worms in adult laying hens. They're a lot less susceptible to them. So do have a think about, your ground from a worming point of view as well. And the other point that I did also want to make about the worming for this particular webinar was there's a zero egg withdrawal for the most commonly used wormer that a lot of people will already be used to, but there's not a zero meat withdrawal. It's a 7-day course of treatment for either layers or for meat chickens. But then if you're going to slaughter them, you need to leave them untreated for 7 days. Whereas if they're layers and they're already laying, you can actually just keep on eating the eggs with Flubenvet or with any of the sort of same active ingredients as Flubenvet. Just be be aware you can't be sort of worming them right before you're going to be slaughtering them. So again, that's a really good reason to prevent worms rather than find that you've got to go and treat your entire batch of meat chickens right before you were planning to slaughter them, because then you're going to have to wait around for another couple of weeks. If they are really losing a lot of weight very fast and they're looking sick, then you're not going to have a choice. You're going to have to do something. You're going to have to treat them, but it can really put a spanner in your plans. Last thing I wanted to say was, do keep bird flu in mind. I know you're sick of bird flu after listening to these webinars, but just if there's going to be a housing order and all of a sudden you've got a whole bunch more chickens on your premises than you would normally have because you were planning on selling a few of the growers after they'd started laying, or you were planning on slaughtering your growers and going back to obviously having far fewer chickens, if you're then hit by a housing order and you're supposed to get them all in, you really need to make sure that you've got internal infrastructure to cope with that. So I know you're sick of hearing about it, but housing orders do exist. Sometimes they come along. A lot of people won't be rearing growers around about the time that bird flu is most likely to be causing us problems in housing order, because that the most problematic time is actually usually around about autumn and winter when the weather is worse. So a lot of people wouldn't necessarily be growing on at that time. But if you're looking for a year-round supply of meat, chicken, or whatever, some people are. Some people do have batches on the go. Hopefully, they do also have a lot of the shelter infrastructure and the housing infrastructure because of that. But yeah, I just don't want to end up with anybody sort of stuck thinking, my goodness, I had planned for, contingencies if I had X amount of chickens, but this week I actually have Y amount of chickens and now I'm in trouble. And that was just a slide from the previous webinar showing some of the solutions that people have gone for. They pressed old polytunnels and things into use. And we do need to remember to keep our biosecurity up at all times, regardless of whether or not we're in the middle of a bird flu epidemic, just because there are a lot of diseases that wild birds can pass on. So you just want to make sure that your boots and equipment and clothing and visitors from other chicken places and things like that, you don't want to accidentally transfer any diseases between. And that's me for tonight, really. Do keep an eye out on DEFRA approved disinfectants. Do try to keep your bedding and your food and water secure. It's just all the usual sensible stuff for growers as it is with your layers. And that's us. Do we have any other questions?
We do have another question already lined up. So now this is over to you, Caroline, because I'm from a derogation area when it comes to burial. One of our attendees has had a really bad experience with a knacker I used many times before. Took the money but never came. I threatened to report them to the regulator, AFA. What are your suggestions? What do we do?
If there were another knacker that covers the same area, because there are sometimes people coming from different directions, you could always see about perhaps ending up on their route instead. If not, then yeah, I absolutely would raise the dispute, because we can't, especially in this time, these times when we're having outbreaks of notifiable disease in poultry in our country, we can't really have anybody dismissing poultry owners and allowing build up of carcasses and things. So yeah, I would give the APHA a wee shout. I would see if you could have a chat to them. It might not necessarily be something that's within the duty vet's remit, because the first person that you might get through to would be the duty vet, but they will hopefully know some of the people on the relevant legislation team that would be able to get back to you. But yeah, no, that sounds really poor. I'm so sorry to hear that you're going through that.
That's excellent. And well, just like to thank you, Caroline, for giving us such an informative talk tonight. Thank you all very much for attending. And I'm sure there'll be emails with feedback things. I hope that you can all join us for the last one. And thank you, everyone, for your time tonight. Thank you very much.
Yeah, have a good evening.
Good evening, everyone. Cheers then.
Bye. Bye.